Just say that my name is Gad Human. I'm one of the organizers of the webinar and seminar, along with Kate Quinn and Steve Cushion. And it's a great personal pleasure to welcome Philip Nanton to our webinar. Philip, as I'm sure many of you know, is a writer and poet. He lives in Barbados, which I know well, but he has been telling us that he has been clearing up from the mess that his volcano in St Vincent created. But we forgive him for that. And we will say something towards the end about an appeal for St. Vincent and because of the volcano. So to say something briefly about Philip, he has published 2 collections, I think, of poetry. He published a book called Frontiers of the Caribbean, and his most recent book, which we are indeed talking about, or he's talking about, is entitled Riff, the Shake Keane Story. His title is changed slightly from the advertised title. It's now The Familiar and the Unique, Framing the Shake Keane Story. We will follow the usual pattern of Philip will give his presentation. There'll be plenty of time for questions. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the chat function if you'd like to use the chat, or raising your hand to ask a question orally. So we will start with Philip and hand it over to him directly.
Good. Thanks very much, Gad. And thank you very much to you all for inviting me to give this presentation on the biography that I've recently completed, Riff, the Shake Keane Story. In talking about Shake, I thought what I would do is start off with a bit of music so that you can get a sense of, because I'm talking about a jazz musician, and it seems silly just to talk. So we'll start with some music from Shake. This is a piece written by Michael Garrick called October Woman. I chose it simply because it's one of my favorite pieces. And if I can get the technology to work again, then we will get underway. Here we go. I'll play for a couple of minutes. So that was uh, some immaculate phrasing by Shake Keane. And you also heard Joe Harriet in the background, and also Coleridge Good playing October Woman. So what I'd like to do now is go straight into my presentation. And as Gad said, it's called The Familiar and the Unique, Framing the Shake Keane Story. So in this paper, I want to discuss the relevance of Riff, the Shake Keane Story for students of the Caribbean. Shake Keane, a jazz trumpeter and flugelhorn player, was born in St Vincent in 1927 and died in Norway in 1997. As a boy, he was an able student who obtained a scholarship to secondary school. And by the age of 20, he was an unqualified teacher of French and music in the colonial island's main secondary school. In 1952, at the age of 25, he migrated to England. He had by this time played in a variety of musical bands on the island and mastered most idioms of popular music. By the 60s, he was at the height of his international jazz career as a trumpet and flugelhorn sideman, member of the Joe Harriet Quintet, the pioneers of free-form jazz in London. This emerged independently of versions of free-form jazz in the USA that was being developed by musicians like Ornette Coleman, Dizzy Gillespie, and Miles Davis. The albums that the Joe Harriet Quintet produced in the 60s were albums like Freeform, Abstract, Movement, and High Spirits, and they are considered jazz classics. From 1960 to 1966, the United Kingdom jazz polls placed Shake as #1 on flugelhorn and trumpet. By 66, he was in such demand that he obtained a regular 3-year contract with the Kurt Edelhagen Orchestra based in Cologne. This was one of the best jazz orchestras in Europe. Shake claimed to have introduced the flugelhorn to European jazz. His musical activities were regularly reported in UK jazz magazines like the New Musical Express and Jazz News. This was in the form of interviews and reviews of his playing. For reasons that I'll discuss, however, despite his brilliance, his prominence lasted only about 5 years. In 1973, he was offered the job of Director of Culture in his fledgling country's newly established Department of Culture. He returned to St Vincent that year with his second partner. During the 8 years that he lived in St Vincent, his poetry flourished to the extent that it was recognized by the award of the Cuban Casa de las Americas Prize in 1979. Less positively, within 2 years, the party that employed him was thrown out of office. He lost his job, and the government department he headed was disbanded. He then spent 7 years in St. Vincent, struggling to survive as a secondary school teacher. The bitterness of this career reversal marked the rest of his life. He emigrated to New York in 1981 and lived in relative obscurity. While there, without a green card, he worked clandestinely, arranging music for Caribbean artists, and though he obtained intermittent gigs in London and Norway, he never achieved the height of recognition of his earlier career. He died in Oslo, as I said, in 1979. No other artist from the Anglophone Caribbean has attained the level of excellence in the fields of both jazz and poetry that Keane achieved in his lifetime. So why might such a personal history be of interest to students of Caribbean society? I can give 2 reasons. First, Riff, the biography, explores what an individual's experience can reveal about his society. And second, it reveals the coexistence of the familiar and the unique in such areas as family history, migration, and return. So I look first at family history and migration and return. Unusually for such a highly accomplished artist, Keane was from the island of St. Vincent. This is an island known more for agriculture than for high culture. The Keane family structure and Shake's early life reveal both familiar and unusual elements of Caribbean family life. He was born into a family on the edge of poverty. His father, Charles, held various jobs, among them estate overseer and police corporal. Shake was fourth among 6 siblings from his father's second marriage, and he claimed that his father also had, as he said, many outside children. So philandering by the male head of household is not an unusual masculine Caribbean practice. Also, not uncommon, Charles was a fierce disciplinarian in the home. But his more unusual quality for the 1930s and 40s was that he taught all his children to play a musical instrument. This skill enabled the Keane family members to form a band and to supplement the household income. Shake's father's iron will also directed Shake to perfect his skills with the trumpet at an early age. This disciplinary background in music spilled over into an appreciation of the value of formal education. He attained a scholarship to secondary school and eventually taught French and music for 5 years as an untrained teacher at the island's prestigious grammar school. But in 1952, aged 25 and frustrated by lack of opportunity, Shake departed for England. He aspired to a university degree in English literature while supporting himself by playing music. He completed 2 years' study at University College London, but as he put it, playing jazz and supporting his then young family won out over his studies. At its simplest, Shake's departure for England is the common Caribbean tale of self-improvement through migration. His circumstances had much in common with those of his fellow migrants from the region. Like many, he traveled with little or no money. He claims to have landed in England with only £11 in his pocket. The average weekly wage around that time was about £9. He was also a black man from the Caribbean joining the existing West Indian population, I think then around 17,000 in the United Kingdom. As such, he was an outsider in a white British environment that increasingly expressed anti-black racism. But he also had advantages not available to many West Indian migrants with only a basic education. He was well-read and already a published poet, having found a niche in regional literary magazines like BIM and Kike Overall in Guyana, as well as the BBC radio program Caribbean Voices. He traveled to England, in fact, with a letter of introduction to Henry Swansea, its editor, and as a result was employed part-time at the BBC until 1965. He had a thirst for knowledge and intended to further his education. He had an ability to read music and to play the trumpet, a grounding in Latin, and a good knowledge of French, which he had taught at secondary school level. These combined skills were beyond many of the native population, as well as his fellow migrants. Shake lived in England and Europe for 21 years before returning to St Vincent for 8 years. He then migrated yet again to live the last 16 years of his life in New York. So I'll look at nostalgia and the pull of return. His return to St Vincent captures another common dilemma experienced by many migrants: the desire to offer service back home versus self-fulfillment in the adopted country. When such an itinerant is a professional musician, for whom travel to different venues and countries is almost a daily constant, the question of home and homecoming has even more resonance. On his return to St Vincent, Shake was full of optimism for the newly created job of Director of Culture in the island's public service. In giving up his career in Europe, he claimed that he had become tired of the regular touring with bands and the demands of session work in recording studios. He had visited St Vincent while working in Europe, and his poetry at that time suggests an element of homesickness. And so in 1973, as his international music career was at its height, he abandoned it. With the wisdom of hindsight, we can see his return was misjudged, as his musical career never recovered. This misjudgment reflected artistic, political, and social tensions between the individual and the society. Artistically, his return highlighted a tension between global recognition and the value attributed to it by a local community. Playing jazz as a virtuoso musician involves responding to other virtuoso individuals and requires a qualitatively different skill set than being a member of a band that offers popular music, for example. Jazz, especially modern jazz, is not a prominent part of Caribbean culture. At the height of the quintet's popularity, the audience in London comprised mainly white Europeans. Shake claimed to have identified no more than about 9 West Indians who turned up to hear jazz at the London venues in which he played, like the Marquee and Flamingo clubs in Soho. He was of the opinion that those who showed up came mainly because they knew him personally and less for the jazz. His observation about the limited appeal of jazz, especially modern jazz, for the average Caribbean person is borne out by the fate of many so-called jazz festivals that the region has hosted over the last 20 years since I've lived here. After a few years, they invariably transition to a more popular musical genre like R&B and soul, and these get incorporated into the event. Return also raises the vexed question of how a Caribbean society responds to the returnee, both politically and socially. Returnees are usually expected to be independently wealthy. Abroad, as it were, was where support came from for those struggling on limited means in the form of the barrel culture and regular cash remissions. The expectation of returnees was that they would build their own homes and be financially independent. Keane was culturally rich, but with limited financial resources beyond his paid job. After he lost his prestigious government post, playing occasional gigs with local dance bands was boring and offered little cash in return. The secondary school teaching that he did to survive was unchallenging and a step back to his more humble status before he originally left the island. The politics of the island and the region in the 60s was also against him. Keane grew up and lived through a time when regional national sentiments were at their strongest, expressed in demands for self-government, the rise and fall of regional federation, and finally the achievement of island-based political independence. This nationalist current brought with it political change and a sense of the importance of nation-making, to which he saw himself responding. But when he departed St Vincent for England in 1952, the island was still a colonial outpost. Only 1 year earlier, it had experienced its first general election under adult suffrage. When he returned in 1973, it was a few years after St Vincent had attained associated statehood with Britain in 1969. The change reflected the coming to power of locally elected politicians. Political party leaders like Ebenezer Joshua, Milton Cato, and Son Mitchell, who gained control of the island's resources and budget, taking over from the British. The political leadership also reflected a form of charismatic big man politics. 6 years after his return, St. Vincent would gain full political independence. If, as a young man, he left the colony, he returned to a place in which local people vied for political influence and power. And local politics was ruthless. His return may well have reflected his misunderstanding of the nature of political change in the region. In 1972, the year of his return, politics in the island was particularly turbulent and the balance of power precarious, as shown by the murder of the acting Attorney General, Rawls, from Dominica. Civil society groups were arguing for political independence. James' son Mitchell, who had won his seat in Parliament as an independent. In the 1972 election, when the two main political parties, the PPP and the SVLP, won an equal number of seats, Mitchell held the balance of power. He successfully negotiated to become the island's premier, with Ebenezer Joshua, the PPP leader then, his deputy. It was in such fraught political times that Keane returned at the invitation of Son Mitchell, an old school friend. Within 2 years, another general election had been called, and Mitchell lost to the SVLP under the leadership of Milton Cato. The personal nature of island politics, as well as suspicions about the loyalty or otherwise of prominent civil servants to new political leadership, affected public appointments. So once Mitchell lost control, Keane's loyalty to the new regime was immediately under question. In 1975, he was sacked from his post and his department disbanded. As one incoming minister of government notoriously commented, "You can't eat culture." Later, Mitchell wrote in his autobiography, Beyond the Islands, that Shake's sacking was an inevitable political response to any institutions that he, Mitchell, had created. Reviewing the whole affair at the time, one prominent local commentator also suggested that the appointment of a relative outsider, Shake in this case, was a source of jealousy among professional civil servants. Shake had not moved up the ranks and was earning a salary from the public purse out of line with senior civil servants. So the price of society's expectations. Another issue affecting Keane was the way art forms are valued in the Caribbean, which are seen primarily as entertainment. Art is required both to be popular and to serve a conservative nationalist tradition, preferably benefiting the tourist industry. Continuity is valued, and breaking of tradition, always challenging, is thus even more of a risk. Indirectly, many Caribbean artists also contribute to this worldview by emphasizing their works' island nationalist associations. So the often heard catchphrase, "We must tell our stories," expresses this worldview. Shake's work in freeform jazz obviously falls well outside this tradition. The statement, "You can't eat culture," is revealing also for its primarily material concern and its implications for the way art is valued. In the 2 years that he was in post, Shake set out a cultural development plan for the new state, which was simply shelved by the new regime that came to power. The post of cultural development took many years to be re-established in the island's public service. And the statement, "You can't eat culture," encapsulates a peculiarly Vincentian contradiction. That is, pride taken in Shake's achievements when abroad, his international achievements when abroad, replaced by a disdain when he returned to offer his skills to the island. His high-profile return and fall from grace through political maneuverings also reflect certain social assumptions about the returnee. The social geographer Elizabeth Thomas Hope observed that locals in Jamaica, those who had been away, often saw returnees as, to quote, "mad." They dressed strangely, were more home-based than out in public, and generally had unreal expectations of Caribbean society. Returnees were expected to be wealthy and remain the source of handouts to poorer relatives and friends. On his return, Shake fell foul of these conventional local expectations. So finally, I'd like to discuss his performance of masculinity. By masculinity, I do not mean a fixed and limited way of behaving, as though there is only one way to be a man, but a range of performances as man, musician, teacher, and poet, through which he searched for a sense of himself and a social role. His masculinity was tested by his failure to realize his full potential in the jazz world of the 60s, modest recognition for his poetry, and finally, a conventional and serial dependence on the women closest to him. Sometimes the performances coalesced, and sometimes they contradicted each other. Now, undoubtedly, his performances of masculinity reflected many features of conventional West Indian manhood. In many ways, he was one of the boys, as the saying goes. The musical environment that he inhabited for most of his life was predominantly a male one. His original instrument, the trumpet, was traditionally seen as a male instrument. Similarly, the touring with all-male bands, as well as being a regular at alcohol-fueled late-night music dives in London Soho with their jam sessions, all reflect conventional masculine behavior. Late in life, his nostalgic longing for friendship manifested in regular phone calls at any hour to male friends dotted around the globe. But there were also less appealing features of this masculinity. He drank regularly and heavily when under pressure. He was an absent father to his 3 children. He was married 3 times. He had 2 sons with his first wife, a 3rd son with a partner outside of marriage. He exhibited a serial dependence on his 3 wives and occasionally lashed out violently against those nearest to him, to the extent that his eldest son suffered severely and developed a drug dependence. His 2nd wife left him because of his violence. So it's important to state plainly that he was not a suffering saint. Finally, I'd like to discuss the conceptual issues I confronted in framing this biography and the influences that lay behind the framework I adopted. But I'll just do this briefly. I encountered two conceptual problems. First, how to frame the biography, and second, what Keane's personal story might reveal about St. Vincent and Caribbean society more generally. I identified three 20th century social currents: migration, nationalism, and a search for masculinity, as central to affecting the Caribbean in the 20th century, and as influential to the shaping of Keane's individual talents and his personality. My understanding of migration and its relationship to diaspora was particularly informed by Robin Cohen and Olivia Sheringham's 2016 study, Encountering Difference, Diasporic Traces, Creolizing Spaces, in which I'm sure you'll know they discuss the dance between the innovative newness of creolization and the relative conservatism of diaspora. My reading of the politics that Keane encountered when back in St. Vincent was informed by Archie Singham's 1968 study, particularly of the Grenadian charismatic political leadership in the 60s. This was Eric Gairy in particular, his work, The Hero and the Crowd. It's also a tale of the tension that can arise between global recognition and local valuation artistically, politically, and socially. Finally, I drew on Peter J. Wilson's 1973 study, Crab Antics, The Social Anthropology of English-Speaking Societies in the Caribbean, as well as Judith Butler's concept of the performance of masculinity to understand Keane's working out of his various contradictory or coalescing performances as musician, poet, teacher, husband, and administrator, all the ways of being a man. So, and the aim then of reading a life through these frameworks is to suggest what that life can reveal about Caribbean society. Thanks.
Great. Good. Well, Philip, you're finished, I think?
I'm done. Yep.
You're done. You're not actually done. Actually, you're not done.
Okay.
But anyway,
okay.
that was no. I wasn't sure that was the precise ending, but that was.
Yes, it was. It was the precise ending.
Good, but that was extremely interesting and very thought provoking, and I will abuse my role as chair to ask you a question which comes to mind and which you addressed as one of your themes, but before people perhaps think about what they might like to ask. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you know, the way you presented Shake Keane's story, particularly in the UK and in London, and his success in London and elsewhere in the 60s, and clearly achieved real success. And so, in a sense, the question is really about the motivation to give that up. And how much did he give up? I mean, you said it was a kind of misreading of the situation, perhaps, in St. Vincent. But how much did he give up in the process? It sounds like a lot, but that's sort of that was what I was thinking about.
He did give up a lot, I would say. I mean, I think it was a combination of this sense of wanting to be part of contributing to the nation, something to St. Vincent society. And I think it was a mixture of that and nostalgia. I think the personal elements came into it also because this was the third relationship he was in. I think there were problems in terms of being able to meet childcare issues and responsibilities, and I think in the book I talk about perhaps an element of him looking for a break to get away from these things, and the return might well have contributed to that as well. So the issue of masculinity and that masculine role and all of that comes into it again very much, I think. Mm-hmm. And the way in which he understood masculinity, I suppose, as well. So I would say that it was a combination of those kinds of, I mean, we never discussed it, although I knew him to talk to and so on to some extent, and I would say he was a sort of a friend. We never discussed these issues, so I'm having to kind of intuit from the situation, and that's how I saw it.
Great. Well, I would just emphasize that if people want to ask a question, they can either raise their hand or ask a question in the chat. I will pursue another question, which I have while people are perhaps thinking, or perhaps they're not thinking, who knows. But Kate has raised her hand. I will just ask you, since I was in the process of it. So on his return, what was the perception of him and his great success? How do people, do you get a sense of how people in St. Vincent actually perceived that and perceived him when he returned?
Oh, I think I would separate the political view from the, I mean, there was an awareness that this guy was probably the most well-known person from St. Vincent in the 20th century. So you're talking about somebody, you know, who had made it in the arts world. In every single decent jazz dictionary, he appears. He's there. And as you know, as the sideman for the Joe Harriott Quintet, and you know, because I mean, he was part of that whole process of creating the British form of free form jazz. We can't really get away from that. So, and I think people were aware that he was this really sort of tremendously larger than life figure, and of course in his style as well. And so, you know, I mean, in the book I talk about, you know, we occasionally we'd go for a drink, and how people would constantly come by in the bar and stop him. And one guy came by and he sang. He literally sang his calypso for him, so that in the hope that Shake would be able to find him a record label and all the rest of the things, you know, saying, you know, this is the way that so he certainly was well known and very much a, you know, a sort of outstanding figure. But of course, as I say, the two problems are that you know, when you go back to the Caribbean, you don't not only have to be well known, but you have to be wealthy enough to be able to sort of show that you've made it in whatever form. You build your big house or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you're not in that situation, then I would say that, you know, you essentially, it's not, people wouldn't say you're a failure, but basically that's the understanding.
Right. I think Kate has raised her hand.
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks, I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to ask more about, you said that particularly modern jazz has not really taken off in the Caribbean, and I wondered if you have any explanation for that, or if you see that as a particularly Anglophone or Commonwealth Caribbean thing. Because if I think of other Caribbean contexts like Cuba or elsewhere, then you would think of jazz. So yeah, do you have any explanation? You mentioned
yes,
festivals that turn into R&B, and
I have to be careful here, because I mean, this is my reading of the situation, and I don't really, this is just from my experience, I suppose I'm saying this, but I feel that it's on fairly good ground. Yes, perhaps it's more the Anglophone Caribbean. I mean, I'm not saying that the jazz musicians, obviously good jazz musicians, have come out of the region. Joe Harriott, Coleridge Good, and there are other guys, particularly guys, this is in the 60s, who came through the famous school in Jamaica for orphans, you know, where they learn jazz. There are a number of others also who made it as jazz musicians. But really, you're talking about individuals. I'd say that the strength of the pull to more popular kind of music, I suppose, to be snobbish about it, more cerebral music, basically, isn't as strong at all. And yes, you will get. I mean, I can't. Yes, certainly the St. Lucia Jazz Festival has had very good jazz musicians, but eventually what had to happen is that, you know, they've had to open it out, because they just the demand was such for. I mean, and jazz also is a very big catch-all category. But if you're talking about jazz where, like freeform, where there has to be a relationship between the musicians playing in a sense, you know, music that isn't conventionally easy on the air, then you're going to search quite hard for it, I would say, certainly in the Anglophone Caribbean. Um, uh, and I'm willing to be corrected on it, but that's certainly my sense of the situation.
Thank you.
Good. So Philip, you knew him, and you said you knew him. So maybe you could, would it be fair to ask you to say what kind of, you know, what was he like in terms of your interaction?
He was wonderful. He was a larger than life character, a very big guy. He very affable. We used to meet occasionally at lunchtime when he was teaching in St Vincent. I was in St Vincent doing my PhD research, and he was back there, and we met once or twice at various clubs and venues. Then we used to meet. The first meeting, one of the early meetings we had, I took a poem because he was a very good poet, and he just scribbled all over this thing, and while we were having a drink in a rum shop near the bar, and sort of just handed it back to me. And he was, in person, a very voluble, kind of open, friendly person. Not self-promoting, which is sort of ironic in a way. So he was actually quite retiring in many ways. But nonetheless, you know, I mean, definitely a person of tremendous substance, and also very popular. He was popular with the jazz and poetry events that were happening in London at the time. And he was always like the comic of the group in the quintet that he played in.
Interesting. Ruth, I think you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Philip. So many years since I've seen you, but you are the person who introduced me to Shake Keane through the SCS. You presented a paper about him.
Oh yes,
way back about 20 odd years.
Yes.
And because of that, when I met a poem in some general reader related, when I was teaching in primary school, and I came across a poem with the name Shake Keane underneath, I thought, this is the guy that Philip was talking about. And I wasn't expecting a Vincentian to be in this collection. And the poem was a piece from a much longer poem that he had written. It started off something like, once the wind said to the sea, I am sad, and the sea said, why, and so on. It goes on, this conversation between. Yeah. So I then looked up later on, I looked up the source of this extract. And this has brought to my attention this and other looking up of poetry by Shake Keane, how difficult it is to access his, he has like at least 2 books of quite long books of poetry, and they're not available. I can't, not having library access, as in university library access, actually there is a need for his poetry to be republished or put on the internet or something so that it can be accessed. So because he's a very good poet, and yet we can't, even if we're interested in his work, we can't celebrate it or publicize it. So that's one aspect, and the same thing in a way connects with the music, because I also have looked up his CDs and so on for his music, and there are, you can get access to the music, but it is extremely expensive. It's almost like it's okay, I mean, there's some bits that are easily accessible, but there are other bits of music where it's like archival collections or rare collections, and so very difficult to be able to afford it. So this is a problem, I think, for him and his reputation, particularly would be within the Caribbean, wider Caribbean context, because if we wanted to promote him, and I think he should be promoted, it seems difficult just from the point of view of the public, to be able to get access to his work. I I was so impressed with the poem, it's all those years ago, and that I did get access to some of his music, and I listened to him play, and I was so impressed with his playing that when I saw that your book was coming out, I pre-ordered it and bought it, and I have read it, and I think that he reminds me of the situation of a kind of group of people within our Caribbean context, or within schooling related to within the Caribbean, where best defined by me giving you I'm going to comment it from a slightly different angle. When we were children playing in the playground, one of the skipping games was something like, what are you going to be when you grow up? And it doctor, lawyer, Indian chief was how the rhyme ended. You know, a rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. Okay. And it always ended with doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. Or that's the bit that people wanted to make sure they got caught on the rope at the right point. And doctor was fine, lawyer was fine. Nobody wanted to be an Indian chief. One of the problems that I'm concerned about within the Caribbean context for people who are high achievers is that we only seem to want to allow people to be high achievers in traditionally defined ways. And those among us who are high achievers but are the Indian chiefs, high achievers outside of the box, we don't make any space for them. And he's a very good example. His life story seems to me to be a very good example of that. So it's more of a comment, but I'd love to hear what you think about it.
I think that, I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to try to bring him back to people's attention in the first place. So you know, as the I tend to agree with you. Yeah, I think there is something in that at the end of the day, Anglophone Caribbean society, for all the noise people make, is a very conservative place. It's as simple as that. It seems to me, having lived there now for 20 years. And so, you know, people will prefer to stick to what they know. They will push the boundaries of it perhaps slightly, but not too much. And so people who go away and do something radically different are going to be kind of fish out of water, especially if they try to come back into the region. It seems to me. And Shake, I think I agree with you. He seems to fit into that mold pretty well. I think things have started to change a bit with the music because there have been re-releases of, for instance, some of that work with Michael Garrick has been put out on CDs, which are not that expensive now, I think. If you check, he had his online discography is pretty good, and the list of it, the listing, and it's possible to find the music. Yes, some of it, certainly if you want to buy it as a vinyl, as an LP, you know, you're in the hundreds of euros and pounds straight away. There's no doubt about that. But the CDs and so on that have been re-released are certainly a little more manageable. The issue with the poetry, I agree with you, is it's like a secret. It's like an open secret that the people who know get into his stuff, and it's difficult to find. It's true. For me to study his first two collections, Lubli and Ixion, the first two he did, I had to go to the special collection of the University of the West Indies Library. I've never seen them anywhere, you know, and they're sort of falling apart now. They're small collections. House of Nehesi did his collected poems, but even the collected poems doesn't include, for example, One a Week with Water, for which he won the Casa de las Americas prize. And he won that prize. And when Casa published it, what they did, which was fair enough, they published 500 copies. And I'm sure those are well and truly long gone now. So finding it is again, you know, a very difficult thing. But that is probably, but it's not in his collected. There are one or two of the poems are in the collected from it. But that is for me one of his most kind of powerful statements, because it involves all kinds of illustrations of moving between jazz and poetry for me. Because for me, what he does is his life is as a person who kind of is in those in between areas between jazz and poetry, both in terms of using the poetry for the jazz and using the jazz for the poetry. And I think One a Week with Water kind of illustrates that in a very tight, like it's like 79, 80 pages, but and it's entertaining, it's funny, it has serious issues, and it's extremely thought-provoking as well. You know, so for example, you will have so a lot of early Caribbean poets, earlier poets of his generation were into jazz and were influenced by jazz. But, you know, whereas they would listen to the music, this man played the music. And there's a big difference when it comes to that relationship, I would say. And so you need to bear that in mind as well in terms of his ability in those two fields.
That's very interesting. That makes me think of course, Kamau Brathwaite, who, of course, didn't play, but did respond to jazz, clearly.
But as I said, Kamau played the piano, played the gramophone.
John has a question. John Calvin. Very good.
I was going to make some. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Some observations. I mean, the first thing is that Shake is taken up by Dennis Preston.
Yes.
So, and that I think is how he's brought together with Joe Harriott. And the first 78s, which are on Lyrigan, and there's one on HMV-GV. I mean, some of those are reissued. I can't remember which off the top of my head. But the problem with the Preston stuff is that the Lansdowne tapes were sold, I think, probably to Universal. And I'm told that they've never been unpacked, and they're probably destroyed by now, because the contracts were suspect, so they weren't touched. So probably one of the reasons why some of this material isn't in circulation, which might include unissued material, is that the tapes are just sort of vegetating if they still exist. No doubt EMI had master tapes from the Lansdowne series once they switched from there from Pi Nixa, but I don't know about that. I mean, the one thing that I remember is that Ernest Bourneman and the Melody Maker couldn't stand Shake's trumpet, and every time a record came up to review which had his trumpet on, he said he was his bête noire. So there were some people that didn't like him, but I mean, I'm just making some observations, really. But I mean, I think that I know, of course, Preston was Eric Hobsbawm's cousin, so there's and sponsorship of the arts as well. So I think that is probably a link. I alas have yet to see your book, but I don't know whether you've explored that. But that seems to me to be one of the in terms of starting his career in the UK, that's probably quite a significant element.
Well, I think starting the career, his career, I would say that it started. The link was with two key people. One was Joe Harriott, and the other was Coleridge Good, and they both played in Mike McKenzie's band, and that's how they met.
Yeah, well, Mike McKenzie was another one that Preston sponsored. I mean, all of that.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that there were Coleridge actually claimed to introduce Shake to Joe Harriott because when Joe Harriott was getting into free form, I think it was Mike Wheeler who was playing with him at the time. He didn't really fancy that direction of the jazz that Joe Harriott was taking. And so after a while he left, and Coleridge introduced Shake, and they hit it off fairly quickly because also they had been playing together. And that so there was a personal connection which came through that route, as far as I know. And that's how he got into the Joe Harriott quintet. And but also that because they were playing together, you know, occasionally, and then that extended into the poetry and jazz, and so that picked up in you know and the other thing that's interesting, but I mean, I must admit, I didn't follow the ramifications of the business side, you know, between the movement, the different interests of the different companies, because I was much more interested in the person and the personal relationships that were operating in terms of Shake's, you know, his life history, because I was kind of much more focusing on, if you like, on the life of the person, and so I just simply can't answer some of those points about, you know, the way that what happened to the music in that.
Well, it's just, I mean, I can observe that from looking at the research I've done on the music scene in terms of recordings in London in the 50s, and certainly the person that would pull somebody in for a session, put sessions together of these types of performers was generally Preston. I mean,
yeah. Oh, yeah. There's no doubt. Absolutely, you're quite right there. I mean, yeah. But I'm saying,
and he also was an experimenter, so it's possible that he suggested, you know, certain routes, musical routes that otherwise might not have been explored, because that was his particular interest. I mean, he was certainly a person on the side of promoting Black British jazz. I mean, that was one of the reasons he, you know, made these recordings. So I can't say any more than that. I mean, the only thing else I remember, and I'd have to look it up, but there was when his Nanton, the melody maker, plans made on the fact that he is a poet and he's also studying at London University. So there's that's all there right quite early when his career starts off in the press, as it were, in the music press, which is intriguing as well.
He was very much in the press, and as he became established, he was much more there. He was interviewed regularly, you know, and of course there were people would cover, report on the sessions that the band played at the Flamingo and so on.
You know, maybe this is a final point, unless somebody else has a question. But you talked about, and John's point makes me think of this, but excuse me, you talked about Shake Keane's involvement in, of course, Caribbean Voices, Radio 3, Swansea, all of that. And we know the work you've done on that, and it's really interesting. And so I don't really like counterfactuals, but if you can imagine, think about, had he not returned to St. Vincent, at least not then, and carried on with his career, since he'd seemed so prominent and so successful. Can you imagine what that life might have been in that sense, in your model of all these interesting themes?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's fascinating what might have been there. I don't know, because you see, I mean, there was this element. I mean, he said at one stage to, I think it was Michael Garrick. He said, Garrick, I interviewed Garrick about this, and Shake said to me something to the effect that I'm all played out at a certain point, because he was in the studio so much, recording and playing and touring and so on. And so there was an element, you know, I don't know if he just, I can't say anything more than that. That's as far as he said. I think that there was certainly a sense of, you know, he hadn't kept up that high level, the demands of high level playing that playing in England and Europe required were no longer demanded of him in the Caribbean. So there was immediately going to be a decline in the standard of musicianship, and that's a real thing, a real problem.
Interesting. Kate has a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a question or if I formulated it very well, but just as you're talking and you're saying about how looking at this individual life and how it might make us think about the familiar and the unique.
Yeah.
And you know, that quotation about you can't eat culture and the kind of conditions that Keane faced in St Vincent and the Grenadines on his return, I mean, it really resonates a lot across the region about the lack of government support for culture and the arts in this period and beyond. I mean, many moons ago, I did my PhD on sort of cultural policy and cultural nationalism in Cuba and Guyana, and sort of through that I've thought a bit about other contexts too. And you know, you can find so many artists who maybe, or writers who returned or chose to stay and maybe get positions within the kind of cultural bureaucracy such as it existed at all, or you know, as you say, find themselves having to leave and make their careers elsewhere. And I just wondered if, you know, what's the picture in St Vincent and the Grenadines today in terms of government support for the arts, culture, have, you know, in some cases governments channel it into particular forms like maybe carnival in Trinidad or, you know, what have you. So I'm just wondering, is there any cause for optimism that a musician, a jazz artist, a creative person today would have better opportunities?
Well, I mean, St. Vincent is a very poor island, and it's still, you know, I mean, I would say that it's limited, you know, to the extent maybe that if you can link to, it's the usual business of linking with outside, I would say, to find an avenue. St. Vincent, on the whole, is fairly traditional still, probably much more so than many of the other islands. But even so, I mean, even places I would say like Jamaica and Trinidad, I mean, yes, of course there are sophisticated musicians and jazz musicians and so on, but really the whole sense, the center of attention, certainly in art, it's still kind of, you know, the nationalistic stuff still wins out basically, and everybody is very keen. You know, the first thing is what you're doing. Are you a poet? And the second thing is where are you from? Which island you're from? It's a bit boring.
There's a question in the chat from Kenneth Campbell.
Yep.
And he wants to know whether you can comment on Shake Keane's contribution to Indo-jazz fusion.
He made, I think it was, yes, he did play within the Indo-jazz fusions. And he owned, but it was a relatively small contribution. I think there are at least probably no more than 3 tracks from the 2 full-length CDs in which he figures. So yes, there was a contribution, but a relatively sort of small one, I would say, in contrast with Joe Harriott.
Interesting. Polly, for people who want to know, Polly has put information on the book and how you can get it. So that's on the chat. And John has perhaps the final question or observation, probably, given what I know about John.
Okay, right. No, I was just thinking, actually, quite interestingly, the first sessions that he does, some with Harriet for Preston, are for the West African market rather than the West Indian market, which is another kind of measure of this multi approach that in which he certainly is involved in here. Obviously, that's, you know, not there in when he's back in St Vincent.
Yeah, he formed a group called in the studio called Shake Keane and the High Lifers, and he played high life music, and he also played with Campbell, the Nigerian high lifer, as well, on his LP.
Right.
at least one of his LPs.
Well, I think we have worked you reasonably hard. Let me put this off here. We've worked you reasonably hard, and
No, it's been
I think
interesting. It's been fun.
yeah, I think the themes that you've raised and the questions that have arisen are really interesting. So we are extremely grateful to you for the presentation, and for Polly for publishing the book, and for, of course, mentioning the way to get the book, which we encourage people to do, of course. I'd like to, in addition to thanking Philip, I'd like to mention that our next seminar webinar is in, I guess, 3 weeks, March 19th. My Warwick colleague, Tim Lockley, will be presenting on the West India regiments in the War of 1812. So a slightly different, perspective. So thank you again, and I would like to hand over to Steve, who will mention the appeal for St. Vincent, which of course some of us think is very important. And Philip, thank you very much. It's really great to see you. Say hi to Jane. And
Will do.
Really good.
Okay, and you guys, thanks.
Okay, yes, I'm sure we've all seen the dreadful scenes of St Vincent and the Grenadines, with the volcano, agriculture ruined, the land poisoned, 15,000 people displaced, thick ash, dust covering everything. Well, one thing we can do is if we can afford it, we can contribute towards helping rebuild. I've put on the screen the appeal from the High Commission for St Vincent and the Grenadines, which has all of the details there of you can either give money directly to the High Commission. There is a link to a GoFundMe, which they are jointly running with the St Vincent and the Grenadines Friendship Trust, or you can give money directly to St Vincent. So the details are all there. I would urge people to give what solidarity they can. People are in a great deal of trouble there, and I think if we can give whatever help we can, it will be much appreciated. I've put the link to the page on the High Commission site in the chat. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Okay.